Major support for Carolina Business Review provided by Grant Thornton. Operating in more than 100 countries, our tax, audit, and advisory professionals specialize in helping companies unlock their growth potential. Colonial Life, providing benefits to employees to help them protect their family, their finances, and their futures. And Sonoco, a global manufacturer of consumer and industrial packaging products and provider of packaging services with more than 300 operations in 35 countries.
With the holidays rapidly approaching, did I just say that out loud? And us continuing to look over our shoulder regarding this economic expansion with questions like, when will a slowdown occur? Is the recession going on now? Will it happen next year, et cetera, et cetera? Welcome again to the most widely watched and longest running dialogue on Carolina business policy and public affairs. I'm Chris William, and thank you for supporting this dialogue all of these years. In a moment, Joe Waters from South Carolina think tank Capita, and Zack Wyatt, Executive Director of the Carolina Farm Trust, joins us. And then later, flashpoints in the Carolinas around policy is certainly education. And it seems like it has and always will be. The North Carolina State Board of Education Chairman Eric Davis joins us, and we hope you'll stay.
Gratefully acknowledging support by Martin Marietta, a leading provider of natural resource-based building materials, providing the foundation upon which our communities improve and grow. Blue Cross Blue Shield of South Carolina, an independent licensee of the Blue Cross and Blue Shield Association. Visit us at southcarolinablues.com. The Duke Endowment, a private foundation enriching communities in the Carolinas through higher education, healthcare, rural churches, and children's services. Barings, a leading global asset management firm dedicated to meeting the evolving investment and capital needs of its clients. Learn more at barings.com. On this edition of Carolina Business Review, Joe Waters of Capita, Zack Wyatt from Carolina Farm Trust, and special guest, Eric Davis, Chair of the North Carolina Board of Education.
Hello, welcome to our program. Zack, welcome to the program. Good, Joe, good to have you back.
Happy to be here.
Zack, I want to talk about Carolina Farm Trust, and just give us a one or two sentence about what this is about. But more importantly, what is Carolina Farm Trust in relation to some of these issues that we talk about, like food deserts, availability for food? And I mean food deserts in urban cores as much as those in rural areas that can't get to it.
Yeah, so our ultimate goal is to rebuild our regional food system from production to consumption, and really looking at it from a systematic approach. There's food insecurity in urban areas, there's food insecurity in rural areas. What is this connection back to food, where it comes from? I mean, I think as the generations have come out of the 40s and 50s, our whole food system changed, and it I think had a lot of unintended consequences that we still are not understanding completely.
Joe, how does that play into not necessarily Capita's role as a think tank around what families and kids, but to that point, how does food insecurity, is that a major central core issue?
Yeah, it's a critical issue, Chris, and I think one of the things too that's so interesting about Zack's work is it's really about rebuilding flourishing food systems and flourishing communities. And flourishing communities and flourishing food systems are necessary for children and families to flourish, whether they're in urban areas and maybe not as directly connected to our rural communities, or they're in rural communities and still lack access to high quality fruits and vegetables, for example. Those are critical issues for children and families, of course, and so we're very interested and supportive of that type of work.
Nonprofits and those specific around food that talk about food insecurity. Zack, back to you. Is the idea of food insecurity, and I don't want to go too far down this road, not that it's not important, but is it a crisis, or is it relegated to a certain demographic?
I think it's becoming a crisis. I think with climate change, our industrial ag system, it is going to be a point where it doesn't matter how much money you have in that bank. If you can't grow food, buy food, I mean, we're looking at foreign corporations coming in, buying up thousands and thousands of acres here in the U.S. With Joe's work, I mean, it's very critical from food insecurity, food access. So food insecurity is I don't have access to it.
Yeah.
I can't afford it. Food access, it's there, I just can't afford it. So even from a health perspective, that one critical pillar of life, and you are basically just on processed food, you're already starting out the gate at a much lower bar than the average person.
Is there a role that higher ed plays, or even lower ed plays in this?
Oh, absolutely. I mean, I think, especially here in CMS, I mean, you have the farm over at Garinger High School.
And you're talking specific to Charlotte?
Yeah, Outteach is a great organization there's a lot of little gardens that are popping up everywhere. But again, with the urban farms that we're trying to create is really getting that first step of building this connection back to where our food comes from. It's this natural, if talk about the affordable housing, if we can get urban farms around affordable housing, will that take the stigma off a little bit? It's just that natural common denominator throughout any socioeconomic class. That food piece brings a lot of people together.
When we go to policy, Joe, around, let's keep talking about education here. In 2017, the governor of North Carolina, Roy Cooper, signed by executive order a commission that is called the Access to Sound Basic Education.
Yep.
It's better known as Leandro, and
Yep.
it comes out of a 1996 ruling on a case called Leandro about making sure that all children have access to basic, good, sound education. I ask you about North Carolina because South Carolina had this ruling in 2004 around Abbeville.
Right.
Are these hauntingly the same?
There's certainly some similarities. I think the key difference from my observation is that in South Carolina, in the Abbeville case, the judge in that case really mandated the remedy, and the remedy was around the expansion of high-quality four-year-old kindergarten in those districts. Ultimately, however, in South Carolina, the plaintiffs lost with a new Supreme Court, and so the General Assembly is kind of at this point off the hook for continuing expansion of high-quality 4K. My caution to North Carolina as they pursue remedies in this situation through the Access to Basic Education Commission is around in South Carolina, we focus exclusively as a result of the Abbeville case on high quality four-year-old kindergarten. And this month, Rural Trust has put out a report that is that identifies North Carolina right there with Mississippi and Alabama in terms of highest need in the country around rural education. The issue is, in South Carolina, we focused only on four-year-old kindergarten. High-quality four-year-old kindergarten is important, but if a child is coming from an impoverished circumstance, those 0 to 3 years are critically important. They lay the foundation for lifelong learning. And then if you exit a four-year-old kindergarten program and into a failing school, that's not going to do much to help you either. So I do think that the solutions, the remedies that are pursued in North Carolina need to ultimately be much broader than the remedies that were mandated in South Carolina.
Really, because you feel like the rifle shot that the South Carolina Supreme Court tried to compel by going the four-year-old route was way too narrow?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, we have got to look 0 to 5, and then we also have to look at how do we actually fix schools in rural communities, because it can't just be that 1 year. That 1 year is critically important, but that 1 year alone is not going to change the trajectory of a child who's growing up in a dire circumstance.
Yeah, okay. We're going to bring our guest on, keep talking about this because these are critical issues. Coming up on this program, we call them encore presentations. They are reruns, but we like to pick the best of the best. That's why we call them encore presentations. Coming up, he is an encore presentation. He's the Chief Executive Officer, relatively new within the last year. His name is Marvin Ellison. Marvin Ellison is the CEO of Lowe's, based in North Mecklenburg County in the center of North Carolina and South Carolina. He will be a guest on our program. Also, Larry Appel, the Chief Executive Officer of Fresh Market, will also join us upcoming on Carolina Business Review. You know, it seems that not that long ago, we used to talk about education, policy, teachers, teacher pay, school supplies, only around the time of elections or at the beginning of a school year or occasionally around the dinner table. Well, now education permeates not just politics and policy and workforce, but education is part and parcel to almost every aspect of daily living and business that we do. In North Carolina, a man close to the center of those contemporary debates is the State Board of Education Chairman, Mr. Eric Davis. He joins us now. Mr. Chairman, welcome to the program.
Thanks for having me.
Mr. Chairman, early on you heard us talking about the Leandro case and the governor's appointment of a commission to specifically take that further. I want to get to the point where, how would you handicap that the commission that Governor Cooper had put in place by executive order in 2017 will be able to find enforcement of what a judicial decision was?
Well, I think the success of whatever comes out of the Leandro case, and actually, before I comment, I should say that this is a pending litigation matter of which we're a party to, so I don't want to prejudge, what the courts are going to do or what will come out of it. But I think the commission will play an important role in it. But I think what's even more important is that success on this matter will require the same thing that success on anything that impacts our children, particularly as it relates to government. It's going to require that the various branches of government work in partnership with sound pressure from the business community and parents and private citizens in order to provide what our children need in terms of education to compete successfully in a brutally competitive world. So I don't think we can just put it on the commission. I think they'll play an important role, but I think it's going to require a broad-based effort. I can tell you from your comments earlier, I totally agree with you. It's going to require more than just a focus on early childhood education, although that is a critical component. Too many of our students today show up behind, and we spend 13 years trying to catch them up. And what I read that is likely to come from the court on this decision is broad-based. It's focused on effective teachers in every classroom, effective leadership in every school, and I would add to that superintendent leadership in every district, revising our accountability and assessment systems to better serve students. Mm-hmm. Particularly, I think we need to focus everything through the eyes of our students, and changes to not only the amount of funding we receive, but how we use the precious funding that we receive from North Carolina. So I'm optimistic that there will come together a group to move this forward, of which the commission will play an important role.
Question, Zack?
Yeah, I mean, I think from a Board of Education standpoint and, from an agriculture standpoint, I mean, when everything is always back to budgets, right? But when can the conversation lead to, here's the right thing to do, let's just say with food in cafeterias, for example. I have 5 kids in CMS.
And by the way, CMS is Charlotte Mecklenburg Schools?
Yes, sir.
Yeah.
So how, just with a simple act of trying to get more local agriculture back into a school system, like what that kind of, the economy, what that would kind of drive. What is the thought process, from the state on trying to do a little bit more to make that happen?
Yeah, well, first, thanks for the opportunity to educate your children. We want to earn that opportunity every day, so thank you for that. I think it relates to, your question relates to how we set standards. And our standards at the state level need to be relevant to the world that the students live in today and the world that they need to compete in tomorrow. And agriculture is an important part of that reality. They need to understand the science behind the agriculture world that we live in, but also the business components and how it relates to their personal well-being and the well-being of their family. And so just by way of example, one thing that I think we ought to do different in setting those standards is we talk about them as North Carolina standards by North Carolina teachers for North Carolina students. We need to modify that to North Carolina standards by North Carolina teachers, higher education educators, business representatives, including from the agricultural sector, to create relevant and important standards for our students going forward. So that's one way that I see that connection.
Mm-hmm. Joe?
Eric, I think one of the challenges with education, right, is that you receive children from families, and sometimes those families are in very difficult circumstances, and that makes it very difficult to educate those children effectively. How are you thinking, as you think about the future of education in North Carolina, how are you thinking about how we can better support families, particularly those in poverty, where the children may be coming from circumstances where they're not, frankly, ready to learn when they get to school?
Yeah, that is a growing, that's one of the 3 curves that I think about in terms of the challenges we face, and that is the growing demands on our children. The number of children in North Carolina from an economically distressed level has grown from about 470,000 to over 870,000 just in the last 15 years. the number of children who come to us who don't speak English has grown from 44,000 to over 102,000. So the demands that our children are coming to us with, the barriers that they experience are growing, and our state has not kept pace with responding to those demands from a funding or a strategy standpoint. So one critical component is that we need to recognize that education doesn't start in kindergarten. It starts at least at birth,
Right.
if not prior to that, and that it's to the well-being of all of us for our state to support families at the time, at least at the time the child's born, and take advantage of those early years that are so critical. We need strategies to help parents educate their children, because the parent is the first teacher for our families. And then as children come to us through kindergarten, frankly, we need to expand our pre-K program, as mentioned earlier, for all children. And then as we have the opportunity to educate children, we need greater supports in our schools around social, emotional, and mental health. We hear from our principals that is the primary challenge that they face. We need strategies around providing stability for families. One of the best stabilities is a family that has a paycheck.
That's right.
And a paycheck that they can live on and support their children. One last example I'll mention. Yesterday I was introduced to a group called E2D, Eliminating the Digital Divide. Pat Mellon. It's a terrific program. The idea is put a computer and internet access and training in every home for every child. You know, we used to think of computers and internet access as a nice to have. It's sort of, but it's as vital now as water and electricity.
Well, you're describing broadband access.
It's more than access. Access is one part of it, but then you got to have the device in the child or parent's hands in the home, and then they've got to be trained in how to most effectively use it. I think we've done a good job expanding access. We've got a digital learning committee chaired by the Lieutenant Governor who's done a sound job of providing access. But what we haven't done is ensure that every child has the tool and the training. I'll tell you, in Charlotte-Mecklenburg, this E2D group has worked hard with 5 of the high schools here at also creating opportunities for students to come in and work in refurbishing computers. They're getting training on their future career, earning a little bit, and doing something to help other students in the school system.
And I don't want to interrupt, Chris, but a clear example of was just yesterday. I had a parent-teacher conference with my youngest. He's in kindergarten. My wife went back to work full-time last year, and I had to pull him out of preschool just because with my daily schedule, and it just kind of switched where preschool he was with me all the time, and he was right on par, with all the where he was developmentally, and then with the conference yesterday, just having him out for that 8 months, he was lagging behind a little bit on letter recognition and some sounds and stuff like that. So it was just very eye-opening to me, just how much that little 8 months, and I think he got a lot with being with me and out and about on some stuff, but, and then the solution that the teacher gave me was, go home, get on the iPad with, these 2 little things and just have him do this. And I think with 3 or 4 weeks, we'll get him right back on track. So it's just kind of that clear example of how important those pre-K stuff is, and then the amount of devices and everything else that can be a solution. And
helping the parent see what tools are available to them and how to use them with confidence.
Right. Mr. Chairman, let me go back to something. You said broadband effort to bring together all the resources of the state. It's a bit of a conglomeration of what you said earlier. So in North Carolina, let's talk about North Carolina just for a second, Eric. Okay. We've got things like many are calling the Leandro Commission that we talked about. My Future NC is out there now, that has kind of come out, is an offshoot of things like Best NC, the North Carolina Chamber's effort. There's EdNC, there's Public School Forum, there's of course DPI, there's the State Board of Education, then we've got over 100 different school boards. It almost seems like there are too many cooks in the kitchen, that's my term. So who ends up leading? And how do you bring together strong-willed people who have great money and great ideas, and who ends up being the quarterback of that all? What does that look like?
Yeah, that's both a blessing and somewhat of a curse if you compare ourselves to our sister south of us, as y'all were discussed earlier, we have far more actors, far more interested and committed partners in the public education spectrum than other states, and we're blessed with that. I mean, it brings tremendous talent, commitment, capacity. It does raise the very question that you're asking: is who's the quarterback, who's running the show? And partly, at least in the formal structure, I think there's the former public education structure at the state, there's a problem there that has long not been addressed and needs to be addressed. But beyond that, historically, the way this state has made progress in public education, particularly in the 90s, was when the governor was the convener and vision setter for our state on what we can achieve. And I think, at least in terms of the way our government is set up, that is the most likely source of that type of visionary and unifying leadership. But it takes, as his partner or her partner, the General Assembly. That's the other critical player in public education in North Carolina.
Is the General Assembly sympathetic? And I know they get vilified, they get canonized by depending on what side. Are they sympathetic to the challenges of education? Since 60 cents of every dollar raised in the state of North Carolina goes to some type of education. Do you get the sense that they want to do that, how you're describing it?
I think that members of the General Assembly cover the spectrum of interest in public education and commitment to public education. I've worked with many of the members on improving the Read to Achieve program, on putting in place many of the things we've recommended to them from the State Board of Education, particularly in this last session, and we're thankful for that. I think we need to do more, though. I mean, by example, our gross domestic product over the last 10 years or so has increased by over 8% in the state. Our funding per pupil is actually down 6%. So it's not a lack of commitment, I don't think. I think it's a matter of prioritization and focusing on strategies together and making sure that we are providing the tools and the strategies. We can't just ask for more funds and keep doing the same thing.
Yeah, right. And I think that's, and guys, I know you're here, but this is like putting a sweater on an octopus, Mr. Chairman, I know. The rub between Department of Public Instruction and the State Board of Education is not just between you and Mark Johnson. I think everyone knows that. However, it does show up in things that seem like an acrimonious relationship. What is it going to take for DPI and the State Board of Education to work seemingly better?
Yeah. So it's really not DPI and the State Board, it is State Superintendent and State Board. I mean, that is really, and unfortunately we were pitted against each other early in Superintendent Johnson's term, which has inhibited our ability to work together since then, and that could be remedied, by the way. But the reality is that over the history of North Carolina, there has always been stress points between superintendents and the State Board of Education. This is, so in some ways, not unique. But what has been a pattern in the past is that regardless of which party holds the board chairmanship or the state superintendency, there's been a way to collaborate and to work together as a team. When Phil Kirk was chair of the board and Mike Ward was the superintendent, they worked together seamlessly. So what I've done recently is a little bit of a study around how did it work before and what were the ways that collaboration occurred. It was to some degree supported by legislation. It was largely based on a commitment to collaborate. And I'll tell you that the current members of the State Board, just as past members, are completely committed to working in a collaborative fashion with the superintendent, because that's what's in the best interest of our students. Put our individual interests aside and let's focus on our students. And so we'll continue that collaboration going forward.
You've been patient. We only have about 30 seconds left. Quick question.
Well, I was just going to say, I think it's absolutely spot on to talk about both the complexity of our education system, but also the collaboration that is required. And I appreciate your vision around how do we manage complexity through collaboration. So I think my question is really just, what's the next 10 years look like for North Carolina in education?
I think there's a number of really great strategies that we could put in place that, and here's one example.
In about 30 seconds.
Okay, I'll use one. Today our system is a time-based system, credit hours, years in school, grades. We need a competency-based system.
Right.
Such that when a student masters a particular area, they move forward, they take on other things. It will enable us to adjust the speed at which students are moving through to meet the students' needs. If you combine that with bringing every child to school prepared to learn, I think the future is terrific, is incredibly bright for North Carolina students.
So there's no doubt that you think everyone wants the same thing for students and families.
Oh, I think that's what we want is as different as our individual children. No, but the important thing is that we come together around the things that will help each other's child, and we view that your child's education and mine are inextricably linked.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Nice to see you. Good luck.
Thank you.
For the benefit of all of us. Good to see you, Joe.
Thank you.
Zach, welcome. Good to have you back. Please come back.
I will. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Until next week, I'm Chris William. Good night.
Major funding for Carolina Business Review provided by Martin Marietta, Colonial Life, the Duke Endowment, Barings, Grant Thornton, Sonoco, Blue Cross Blue Shield of South Carolina, and by viewers like you. Thank you. Promotional consideration provided by Business North Carolina Magazine. For more information, visit carolinabusinessreview.org.